She mocked me for 14 years without ever raising her voice, and it took exactly one word to end it. Not a shout, not an argument, just 3 syllables, spoken quietly across a dinner table, and I watched my brother-in-law's whole understanding of me collapse in real time. I hadn't planned for any of it to happen that night. I showed up to my in-laws' house carrying a bottle of red wine and the particular exhaustion of someone who'd just come off 2 straight weeks of overnight watch rotations, hoping for nothing more than a plate of food and an early night. My husband Michael had warned me his brother would be there, the way he always did. Half apology and half brace. Derek had a talent for making every gathering revolve around Derek, and family dinners were his favorite performance. He was already holding court when we walked in, a glass of scotch in one hand, telling a story about some training exercise off the Carolina coast, like he'd single-handedly kept the whole fleet afloat. Derek was a lieutenant, surface warfare, and to be fair, he'd worked for the rank. But somewhere along the way, ambition had curdled into something uglier, a need to be seen as the family's real success, the one who'd chosen danger over comfort, service over softness. For years, without ever asking my permission, I had been the measuring stick he used to prove it. I never talked about my work. Not because I enjoyed the mystery, though some nights the silence was almost a relief, but because most of what I'd done in 14 years didn't belong to me to share. It belonged to the people who'd trusted me with their lives in places that didn't appear on any map. So when people asked, I gave them the honest, unsatisfying answer. Administrative work, some logistics, nothing worth mentioning. It cost me nothing to let them believe it, or so I thought. Dinner went the way it always did. Derek's mother fussing over the roast, his father pouring wine like he was rationing something precious, and Derek working the table like it was a promotion board. Tonight's material was a joint exercise he'd just returned from, and he told it well, I'll give him that. The tension, the coordination, the moment his ship held formation through weather that would have turned most stomachs. People leaned in. Michael squeezed my hand under the table, the small, apologetic gesture he always made when his brother got going, like he could absorb some of it on my behalf. Then Derek's eyes drifted down the table to me, sitting quietly near his father's old friend, a broad-shouldered man with gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who'd spent a career learning not to move unless it mattered. Derek smirked, the way he always did right before saying something he thought was clever. You're Navy too, right? He let the pause hang just long enough to be cruel. I'm guessing you've never actually been on a real mission. The table laughed, that easy, complicit laugh families give the loudest voice in the room. Michael's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, because saying something never worked, and we both knew it. I didn't rise to it. I never did. I just smiled the same closed, patient smile I'd worn through 100 rooms like this one and reached for my water glass. That's when the old man at the end of the table lifted his eyes. He'd been quiet all evening, the kind of quiet that isn't absence but attention. I'd assumed he was simply tired, an old friend of my father-in-law's along for the ride. He set his fork down. He looked at me. Really looked. The way you look at someone when a piece of memory is trying to surface and match a face to it. What's your call sign? He asked. Just that. No one at the table had any reason to ask that question, and for a second, something in my chest went completely still. Not fear, something closer to 2 separate lives touching for the first time in a room where they were never supposed to meet. I felt Michael go rigid beside me. I felt Derek's smirk hovering, waiting for whatever punchline he assumed was coming. Wraith, I said. The old man didn't nod. He didn't smile. He set his fork down against the plate with a small, deliberate click, the sound of a door quietly closing on Derek's version of the evening. Derek's laugh died somewhere in his throat. Nobody else at the table understood what had just shifted, why the air had changed, why his father's old friend was suddenly sitting up straighter, studying me like I was a name pulled from a file he was never supposed to see twice. As the plates were cleared and conversation limped back towards safer ground, Derek leaned toward me one last time, that old confidence flickering back into his voice. Maybe one day you'll see what the real Navy looks like, he said, almost gently, like he was doing me a favor. I only smiled. Maybe, I said. I didn't tell him I'd been living in the real Navy since before he finished his first deployment brief. Some things you don't explain. You let people find their own way to the surface. The call came the next morning while I stood at the kitchen counter, coffee going cold, half listening to Michael explain to our daughter why her shoes didn't match. My phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number, a Virginia area code, and some old instinct told me to step onto the back porch before answering. Commander Bennett? The voice was gravel wrapped in discipline. This is Walter Hale. We met last night. Master Chief Hale, I said, and I heard him exhale like a man confirming a suspicion he'd carried since the moment I said one word at that table. He told me carefully, the way men like him always speak, that he'd recognize something in my voice the instant I answered his question. Not the call sign itself, the way I'd said it, flat, practice, the particular reluctance of someone trained to give up information only when it served a purpose. You were with the Joint Reconnaissance Element, he said. It wasn't really a question. We talked a while longer, carefully, the way two people talk when they share a language most people around them have never learned. And somewhere in that careful exchange, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For years, I'd carried the loneliness of being fully known by almost no one, walking through my own family's holidays as a kind of half-person, present but invisible. Walter Hale didn't need my file. He already understood the shape of the years I couldn't discuss. After we hung up, I stood on the porch a long moment, turning the conversation over. It should have felt like nothing. An old sailor recognizing an old call sign, a coincidence in a service as tight-knit as ours. But it didn't feel like nothing. It felt like a thread had been pulled, and I'd learned enough about threads to know they rarely stop at one tug. Derek, of course, was not so restrained. I heard about it from Michael 2 days later, delivered with the weary half-smile he always wore when relaying his brother's latest performance. Derek had been telling the story of Saturday's dinner all over the base, to his fiance's parents, even to a stranger at the gym, recasting the moment as some minor curiosity rather than the small earthquake it had actually been. Some old guy got confused, he'd said, laughing it off, though Michael suspected his brother had spent more than a few private hours unable to fully shake it. It was Michael who told me, almost apologetically, that Derek had invited us to the Fleet Heritage Ball the following month. A formal affair, dress whites, admirals and their spouses, the kind of event where careers were quietly measured against one another over champagne. Derek had never invited me to anything like it before. I understood immediately why he was doing it now. He wants people to see the difference, Michael said carefully, watching my face for a reaction I didn't give him. Between his life and yours. He wants to prove something. I only nodded. Tell him we'll be there, I said. The ballroom smelled like polished brass and orchids, chandeliers throwing gold light across a sea of dress whites and gowns. I stood near the bar in my own uniform, ribbons in their proper rows, feeling the familiar weight of an evening I'd attended 100 times in 100 cities, though never quite like this one. Derek found us within minutes, resplendent in his whites, working the room the way some men work a job interview that never ends. It didn't take him long to find his opening. He steered a cluster of junior officers toward us with the practiced ease of a man introducing a punchline. "This is my sister-in-law," he said, clapping a hand briefly on my shoulder. "She's Navy too. Mostly desk work, though. Paperwork, scheduling, that sort of thing." The group nodded politely, the way people do when they have no reason to doubt what they've been told. I let it sit. There was no version of that room where correcting him would have served any purpose, and I'd spent too many years letting people underestimate me to feel any real sting in it. We'd barely finished our drinks when the room shifted. It wasn't loud, the way these things rarely are, just a subtle change in posture rippling through the clusters near the entrance. A rear admiral had arrived, gray-haired, broad through the shoulders, the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice to command a room. His eyes swept the crowd once, the practiced scan of a man cataloging who mattered where. Then they stopped on me. I felt Michael go still beside me. Derek, mid-sentence with one of the junior officers, faltered as the admiral began walking, not toward the senior staff gathering near the stage, but directly toward us, cutting a clean line through the crowd like the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. "Commander Bennett," he said, his hand already extended. "Good to see Wraith again." The name landed in that room like a dropped glass. I felt it ripple outward in real time, junior officers exchanging glances, Derek freezing entirely, the practiced ease draining out of his posture like water through a cracked container. "Admiral," I said, keeping my voice even, the tone I'd used in 100 briefings where showing surprise was its own kind of failure. "It's good to see you too." He held my hand a beat longer than protocol required, studying my face with something between warmth and quiet reverence. "Heard you'd transferred stateside," he said. "Didn't expect to run into you at a ball of all places." He glanced briefly at Derek, at Michael, taking in the family resemblance without needing an introduction, and something in his expression suggested he understood far more about the dynamic in front of him than anyone had told him. Before he moved on, he turned back once more, his voice pitched just low enough to feel private and just loud enough to be heard by everyone still watching. "The fleet doesn't forget what you did out there, Commander. Neither do I." Then he was gone, swallowed back into the current of the room, leaving behind a silence louder than the quartet still playing somewhere in the background. Derek hadn't moved. He stood there with his glass forgotten in his hand, staring at the space where the Admiral had been, then at me, then back again, like a man trying to reconcile two versions of a story that could no longer both be true. The days after the ball had a strange texture, like weather that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. Derek didn't call. He didn't bring it up at the next family dinner either, though I caught him watching me across the table more than once, doing math he didn't like the answer to. Michael noticed it too, mentioned almost in passing that his brother had gone quiet in a way that wasn't like him at all. It didn't last. A week later, Michael told me his brother had started asking questions, quiet ones at first, to friends stationed at the Pentagon, to an old classmate working personnel records, fishing for whatever he could find about a lieutenant commander named Grace Bennett. What he found, or rather didn't find, only made it worse. Every inquiry ran into the same quiet wall. His classmate, a man with reasonable clearance, told him flatly that whatever I'd been part of sat several levels above anything he was authorized to see, and that continuing to push might draw exactly the kind of attention he didn't want on himself. He thinks you're exaggerating, Michael told me one evening, or that people are just being polite because of who you're married to. I wasn't surprised. It's a strange thing, watching someone choose disbelief over a truth that's inconvenient to their own story. Derek had built an entire identity on being the family's proof of courage, and admitting that a woman he'd spent years quietly dismissing might have carried more than he ever had wasn't a truth he could simply absorb over dinner, so he dug in. I heard through the family grapevine that Derek had started telling a new version of events, that the Admiral's greeting had been a courtesy, nothing more, that Wraith was probably some minor call sign blown out of proportion by an old man's failing memory. A few relatives nodded along, relieved to have a simpler story to hold on to. I let him have it. There was no version of confronting him that would have served any purpose beyond my own satisfaction, and satisfaction had never been the point. Still, there were nights I lay awake beside Michael, turning it over, because I understood exactly where this was heading. Derek wasn't going to let the mystery dissolve quietly into family legend. Men who need to win don't walk away from a hand they think they're still holding. He was going to force the issue publicly, in front of people whose good opinion he valued more than mine. He chose his moment at his own engagement dinner, hosted at the Officers Club near the base, a room full of white tablecloths and more brass than I'd expected for what was supposed to be a private occasion. I understood the moment I saw the guest list exactly what kind of stage he'd built for himself. He waited until dessert. That was Derek's style, letting the wine do half the work before he made his move. "Before we get to the happy stuff," he said, standing, glass in hand, smiling around the table, "I want to clear something up because I think everyone here deserves to know the truth." His eyes found mine, and for the first time all evening, the mask slipped just enough to show me what was underneath. Not confidence. Something closer to desperation dressed up as confidence. "Grace, why don't you tell everyone what you've actually done? No vague answers this time. Just tell them." The room went quiet, in that particular uncomfortable way rooms go quiet when someone decides to turn a dinner into a trial. I set my fork down, unhurried, and looked at him for a long moment before I answered. "I can't do that," I said simply. "You know I can't." Derek's smile went wide and sharp, triumphant. He turned to the table like a lawyer delivering a closing argument. "Exactly," he said, spreading his hands. "There's nothing to tell. It's always been a story, a mystery people want to believe because it's more interesting than the truth. She works a desk job, folks. That's the whole thing." He laughed, short and satisfied, and lifted his glass like the matter was settled. I didn't defend myself. I never had, and I wasn't going to start in a room full of people who either already knew the truth or didn't need to. I simply held his gaze steady and let him have his moment because I understood something Derek never had. A lie only holds as long as the silence around it stays undisturbed. The silence broke almost immediately. At the far end of the room, a rear admiral had just stepped up to a small podium set up for the evening's formal toast. He'd barely begun his opening remarks, something gracious about tradition and service, when his eyes caught mine across the room, and the words simply stopped in his mouth. He set down his notes, and every head in the room turned to follow his gaze as he stepped down and began walking, unhurried, deliberate, straight toward our table. Derek's glass hovered halfway to his lips. I watched the color drain slowly from his face as the realization crept over him second by second that this was not going to go the way he'd planned. "Commander Bennett," the Admiral said, his voice carrying easily across the now silent room. He extended his hand, and I stood to take it, feeling 200 pairs of eyes settle on us at once. He held on a moment longer than protocol required, then turned to face the room, still holding my hand, like he wanted everyone present to understand exactly what they were witnessing. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the particular gravity of a man who rarely spoke without purpose. "I don't know what's been said here tonight, but I want to say something myself. This officer has saved American lives more times than most of us in this room will ever know, in operations most of us will never be cleared to hear about. I've had the privilege of working alongside Commander Bennett on 3 separate occasions, and I can tell you with absolute certainty, there is no braver officer wearing this uniform tonight." The silence that followed was absolute. Derek sat utterly still beside me, his carefully constructed narrative collapsing in real time in front of the exact audience he'd assembled to destroy mine. Somewhere near the back, one of the older officers began quietly to clap, and within seconds, the sound rippled outward until the entire room was on its feet. I didn't smile. I simply nodded once at the Admiral, thanked him quietly, and sat back down, aware of Derek beside me, white as the tablecloth, staring at his own hands like he no longer recognized them. News like that doesn't stay contained to one room. By the following week, the story had made its way through the base, not through any effort of mine, but through the officers who'd been there and weren't inclined to keep it to themselves. Derek's world was quietly rearranging itself around him. A fellow lieutenant approached him at the gym, asking, with genuine curiosity, what it was like being related to Wraith. He laughed it off the first time, brushed past it the second, and by the fourth mention, something in him had visibly begun to shift. The deeper unraveling came from an unexpected direction. A commander Derek had once served under, a man he deeply respected, pulled him aside privately after hearing the story secondhand, and mentioned that he'd once served in a joint operation alongside a task force led in part by an officer known only by a single call sign, and that several men in that unit still spoke of her with a kind of reverence Derek had never once heard directed at himself. The commander hadn't said it to embarrass him. He'd said it because he assumed Derek already knew, and the assumption alone had been its own quiet blow. Derek came to see me 2 weeks later, alone, without Michael there to soften whatever was about to happen. He showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, the easy swagger gone, replaced by something uncertain and unpracticed. I invited him in. We sat at my kitchen table, and for a long moment he simply stared at his hands, saying nothing at all. "I don't know what to say to you," he finally admitted, his voice stripped of its usual polish. "I spent years thinking I understood exactly where I stood compared to you. Turns out I didn't understand anything." I didn't rush to fill the silence for him. I let him sit in it, because whatever came next needed to come from him, unhurried, without me softening the shape of it. "I've spent my whole life needing to be the one who did something," he said quietly, "and I never once considered that the person I was competing with might have already done more than I could imagine, and just never felt the need to say so." I studied him for a moment, this man who'd spent years measuring his worth against a woman he'd never bothered to actually know, and felt something soften in me that I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness yet, that would come later, and it would come on its own terms. But something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. The sight of a man finally standing at the edge of a truth he could no longer avoid. His apology, when it finally came in full, wasn't delivered in a single dramatic sentence. It unfolded slowly over the weeks that followed, in small gestures more than grand words. A phone call just to ask how my week had gone. An offer to help Michael fix the fence line behind our house. A quiet correction when a cousin at a barbecue made an offhand joke about desk jobs that Derek once would have laughed along with. There was one conversation that mattered more than the rest, and it happened, fittingly, at another family dinner, the same table where his cruelest joke had once landed. Derek stood partway through the meal, and for a moment, my chest tightened instinctively, some old reflex bracing for another performance. But his face wasn't wearing that expression this time. "I owe you an apology," he said, turning to me directly rather than to the room at large. "And not just for that comment at dinner all those months ago. I've spent years making you smaller than you are because it made me feel bigger than I was. I didn't know I was doing it, but I was. I'm sorry for every time I made you shrink at your own family's table." I let the words settle before I answered. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it fully, without reservation. But I wanted him to understand something too. "Respect isn't earned by talking about what you've done," I told him. "It's earned by staying quiet after you've done it." He nodded slowly, and I saw the words land somewhere real in him, not just as an absolution, but as a lesson he intended to carry forward. Derek lifted his glass then, and this time there was nothing performative in the gesture at all. To my sister-in-law, he said, his voice steady, the bravest sailor I've ever met. Glasses rose around the table, a soft chorus of agreement, and I felt years of quiet, necessary silence settle into something that finally felt like being fully seen. I want to be honest, though. I hadn't needed the toast. I'd built a life that didn't depend on anyone's recognition, because recognition had never been the point of any of it. Not the missions, not the medals gathering dust in a drawer no one else was cleared to open, not even the call sign that had for one strange season upended an entire family's assumptions about who I was. I'd done the work because it needed doing, and I'd carried the silence because it was the price of doing it honorably. But I won't pretend the toast meant nothing. There is a particular quiet grace in finally being understood by the people who share your table, even when you never asked them to understand you in the first place. Nobody at that dinner asked me how many missions I'd run, or what Wraith had really meant to the people who once depended on it. They didn't need to anymore. They'd learned the hard way, the way families sometimes have to, that some of the strongest people you'll ever know are the ones who never once needed you to know it. If this story moved you, I'd love to know where it found you tonight. Leave a comment and tell me which moment stayed with you the longest. Stories like Grace's remind us that real strength rarely announces itself, and the people we underestimate are often carrying far more than we'll ever know. We share stories like this every day, so if you don't want to miss the next one, go ahead and subscribe. There's always another journey waiting for us to take.